few words of condolences to the loved ones of those affected by the tragedy at Bow Glacier Falls in Alberta. On behalf of those who lost their lives in this tragic incident, their families, and recovery to those injured. And I want to thank the first responders and Parks Canada employees who've been conducting the search and rescue efforts over the course of the last 24 hours. So why we're here. We would only keep you here this late on a Friday, the first day of summer, for something that is really, really important. And today is a very important day for Canada. Bill C5, our government's One Canadian Economy legislation, has just passed the House of Commons.
And Bill C5 is based on two pillars. Both are very important to build a unified Canadian economy. That bill is intended to build a stronger, more competitive economy, a more resilient one that benefits all Canadians. It is designed to answer this pivotal moment with urgency and determination.
Part of the bill eliminates federal barriers to internal trade and labour mobility, as first promised by the Minister of Internal Trade, Minister Freeland. It is our contribution to a much broader effort with all the provinces, all the territories, to eliminate the barriers that have held our country back for far too long. Barriers that cost Canadians as much as $200 billion in lost opportunities every year. That's equivalent to around $50,000 for every Canadian. And with the changes to labour mobility, it will help Canadian workers to do their jobs wherever they want to in this great country. The second component of this bill is especially consequential for our nation. Canada
is a country that used to build great things. Expo 67, from its conceptualization to its completion, only took 4.5 years.
7 locks stretching over 300 kilometers that transported more than 3 billion tons of cargo since it opened in 1959 took just 5 years from concept to building. These were some of the nation-building projects of our past. Major structures built with ambition and determination that connected and transformed our national economy. They represent much of how we will build again now. But today, with this bill, the word nation carries a much greater meaning. These projects will build our national economy, and through Indigenous equity and resource management, these projects will be built with Indigenous nations and communities. This is not an aspiration. It is the plan embedded in the bill itself. The
purpose of the bill was based on the importance of protecting the environment and involving the Indigenous people. That determination is at the very core of this bill. With this legislation, we will identify nation-building projects. In other words, those projects that will strengthen the resilience and the economy of this country. That is undeniably important for Canada, and there is a strong probability that these projects will succeed and contribute to clean growth and Canada's climate goals, while at the same time focusing on the interests of the Indigenous peoples. For any project that meets those criteria, we will consider them to be approved right from the outset and will thus accelerate the evaluation process. Indigenous communities will be consulted in a significant manner throughout the process of determining which projects are of national interest and also throughout the development of the conditions surrounding each project.
Canada's United Nations Declarations Act. Federal laws are to be in alignment with UNDRIP and therefore respect the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. It's the right thing to do. The Major Projects Office, created by this bill, will have an Indigenous Advisory Council whose core function will be to honor Section 35 rights in the implementation. It will have First Nations, Inuit, and Métis membership and regional representation. We've already announced additional funding to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis coming to the table to participate and to enhance capacity building in this new process, from participation in negotiations to project selection and development, and continuing to support those groups with nation building. I thank the ministers, Indigenous caucus, and leadership from across the country for sharing your perspectives and your sincere openness to getting this structure right. We all agree that more fulsome conversations are needed to select the nation-building projects and to determine the conditions that they must fulfill. In other words, the real work begins now. We will have those. Indeed, we must have them because the bill requires them. It takes time to build trust and to build shared leadership. That means building an economy where Indigenous communities participate fully in the national economy, where Indigenous microeconomies are not isolated but integrated into large-scale projects that connect communities to the national economy, creating more jobs and greater prosperity for all. That's why the first thing we will do to launch the implementation of this legislation in the right way is through full-day summits with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis rights holders, leadership, and experts. To that end, I will be meeting with First Nations rights holders on July 17 here in Ottawa, Inuit leadership in late July, and Métis leadership soon thereafter. I'll attend these meetings alongside the responsible ministers, which will include working sessions and public roundtables. The
First Nations, the Métis and the Inuit know the best process to ensure the future of their communities and what real consultation can mean for their lands. I am looking forward to hearing the concerns and views of rights holders as well as their ambitions. In order to do that, we will be holding in-depth discussions. Ministers Leblanc, Freeland, Alton, and others will be present, as well as senior government officials, and will ensure that there are open and honest discussions between the federal government and stakeholders.
Consultation, cooperation, engagement, participation are at the heart of this bill, C5. That is how we build our nation. Being a reliable partner to Indigenous peoples is not just about upholding the duty to consult. It's about enabling the creation of long-term wealth and prosperity for Indigenous peoples through full equity ownership. That's why we've already doubled the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program from $5 billion to $10 billion, enabling more Indigenous communities become owners of major projects. As Bill C5 moves on to the Senate, I want to underscore that this bill and the economic potential that it will unleash for our country is critical. For far too long, when federal agencies have examined a new project, their immediate question has been why. Now, they will instead ask themselves how. The process to build in this country, which has become too arduous, has taken too long, and has been holding us back, is changing. In the past, with every year that a proposal to build a port, a wind energy farm, or a highway sat on an official's desk, we were leaving investment, prosperity, and jobs, people's careers on the table. We've been keeping ourselves dependent on foreign powers. But by building at home, we will truly make Canada strong. One strong, united, and unified Canadian economy. Breaking down trade barriers, breaking down labor barriers to build that strong Canadian economy. That's what we're doing with the introduction of today's legislation. You know, this government was elected on a promise to break down those barriers and to build things big and faster. Because we know, Canadians know, that we can give ourselves far more than any foreign government can ever take away. We can build big, build bold, build now, and with this legislation, build one Canadian economy. Nous pouvons bâtir un Canada meilleur.
We can build a better Canada for generations to come. Thank you.
I would now like to ask Minister Gull-Masty to say a few words.
Bon après-midi tout le monde. Hello. As the first Indigenous Minister of Indigenous Services, every day I work in partnership with Indigenous leaders to build strong and sustainable communities. Every facet of Indigenous communities are interconnected, from health to education to social wellness and to physical infrastructure. The prosperity of Indigenous communities is intertwined with the ability to ensure capacity building as part of investments and projects like those that are in the One Canadian Economy Bill, and that it will be made possible. Indigenous peoples belong and are in the rooms and at the tables where discussions happen and decisions are made. As part of this government, I know the importance of a relationship, and the Prime Minister has made it part of a critical path forward. Indigenous participation is essential and an important part of the fastest growing G7 country in the world. Ensuring that government moves forward includes upholding Indigenous peoples as part of it in their rightful place by determining it for themselves. I
am the first Indigenous Minister of Indigenous Services, and I am here guided by the knowledge and the wisdom of those who came before me. I want to ensure that their voice and their concerns are heard at the highest levels of government. As a member of the Indigenous group, I am directly involved in that work aimed at building a prosperous future for all of Canada. I am grateful to be able to work next to my Indigenous colleagues in this country. From the very outset, Prime Minister Mark Carney has really started a dialogue with us to ensure that we can share our knowledge and take the right path.
It is our legal and constitutional duty to consult, to engage nation to nation, and to serve Indigenous communities across Canada. We are advancing our shared priorities of social, cultural, environmental, and economic progress as we move forward on this path, together with true reconciliation, because this is what Indigenous peoples want, and this is what Indigenous people, most importantly, deserve. Thank you. Miigwech, merci.
We'll now begin the question period. On va maintenant commencer la période de questions. We'll start with Alicia.
Hi, Prime Minister Mark Carney, Alessia Pasifumi with the Canadian Press. A lot of the criticism of C5 seems to be focused on the hasty way that your government put the bill together. Do you have specific projects you're hoping to greenlight once the bill gets royal assent, and is that why you have rushed it through Parliament?
No, I thank you for the question. It's actually the other way around. We need this legislation in order to begin the process of determining those nation-building projects. This legislation, in effect, is enabling legislation. It creates the ability to have nation-building projects. It creates the ability to flip, as I said, and as you've seen in legislation, the attitude towards those projects, once they are selected, once conditions are put in place, how those projects can move forward as opposed to why. But this is where the real work begins once this becomes legislation, obviously moving to the Senate and beyond, but once it becomes legislation, is this process of identifying those projects. Now, the provinces have made a number of suggestions, many of them potentially quite good suggestions, but the engagement needs to move from higher level concepts to more specific projects. The partnerships that need to be established will begin now, in effect, and the first step in that process will be those meetings I referenced, those launch meetings with Indigenous peoples, beginning with First Nations, then the Inuit and Métis. So that's the process to determine them. And last point, the projects obviously do need to meet the criteria that's set out in the bill.
And I appreciate that you're mentioning now that you're having these meetings. I've been talking to chiefs and community members for the last 3 weeks, and they're talking about damaged relationships that your government, or sorry, the Liberal Party has built over 10 years. Was passing the bill in this way worth damaging those relationships?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I'd put. One is that we've had consultations for this legislation with over 125 different Indigenous groups, organizations, first point. Second, this bill, which we ran on in the federal election, to be clear, the core of our offering in the federal election was to build Canada strong, was to build in a new way, was to build in response, to build at home one Canadian economy, the name of this act, but not just the name, the essence of this act, to build and to be masters in our own home, collectively, but to build in a truly Canadian way. And a truly Canadian way is in full partnership with Indigenous peoples, which this creates the ability to do so, in fact, creates the requirement to do so, and we were clear throughout this. It was one of the biggest differences between the way we approached infrastructure in these projects and other parties, virtually every other party in the federal election, and also in a way that respects and is consistent with our environmental commitments. Thank you.
Prochaine question.
Stuart Benson with the Hill Times. Just sort of on the same vein, I've had a lot of maybe the same conversations as Alessia, and the thrust of this, a lot of the groups, First Nations, Indigenous organizations I've spoken to, they're not opposed to the bill. They understand what's in the bill. But when it comes to free, informed prior consent, they want to know that if a project needs their territory or their resources, that if they're opposed to it, that no will be a full sentence, full stop. And in the same way that in the bill it does require consent from the provinces, can you say once and for all, just unequivocally, that a no from a nation would be a full stop?
So just to be clear, I think on all of these things, we have to flip around the orientation. Projects are built in partnership. Nations are built in partnership. Nations are built positively, not negatively. If there are not groups coming together, if it's not in the interests of the country, if there's not directly, and it's absolutely clear, not just in the bill, but in the entire policies of this government. It's why we have the $10 billion Indigenous loan guarantee. It's why we are funding the consultations and the capacity building. It's why we're starting with the literal launch of the process of this nation-building process is with First Nations, literally that, in full partnership. And we're looking for, collectively, we're looking for those projects that will build the nation positively. So many of the questions come in a screen and a negative, but projects don't move forward unless you have that partnership and that positive. And that's what the positive aspect of free, prior, and informed consent means, and that aspect begins now.
And just sort of something completely different, but not to immediately start nitpicking on the stuff you didn't get done this summer, but when I look at some of the other bills that have been proposed
Summer,
since
it's
the
the
election.
literally the first day of summer.
Oh,
So,
well,
we've got-
but I mean, before the summer. But when I hear some of the rationales for why we needed to expedite Bill C5, I hear a lot of the same justifications that could be used for the border bill, C2 on, so I guess shaking your head, so you would disagree, so I was just wondering.
Look, the government focused on two things. Immediate affordability relief for Canadians, and the Ways and Means motion passing a middle-class tax cut that was delivered on July 1st, the cut in the GST for homes, and making permanent the cut in the consumer carbon tax. We delivered that. We delivered that. First thing. Secondly, the most important economic initiative this country has seen for a long time, you can pick the period of time, and ultimately will be judged by the projects that come, is this bill. This is what unlocks the potential of our country in partnership. This is what makes us different from the United States. This is what will make us more independent from the United States. This is what's going to move us forward, all coming together in a broad range of nation-building projects. This bill unlocks that. Yes, it unlocks it in quick time, but in quick time because we are in a crisis. And if you don't think we're in a crisis, go to Sault Ste. Marie, go to Hamilton, go to Windsor, go to Besançon, go to any lumber forestry project. And there's more coming. And this is the response. This is us being in charge of our destiny. That's why we pushed it. And I want to give full credit to all the members of the House who supported this bill, including the Conservative Party, who stood up and supported it because they recognized the importance of doing it.
Question, question. Next question.
Good evening, Mr. Prime Minister Jeremy Sherrill, CTV News.
Yeah.
You've been compared this week to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the way he pushed bills through. Is this going to be your approach moving forward?
Look, this is a unique situation, given the crisis, in my judgment. And I'll refer to my previous answer, and I will also refer to the cross-party support that this bill just received, the overwhelming support this bill just received, and that was through hard work. It was because it's the right response to the circumstance. The bill was improved by the parliamentary process. There were a number of amendments which were taken and moved forward. And now the challenge is in very much, well, once it goes through the Senate and becomes full legislation, in the implementation.
President Trump criticized Canada again today on defense spending, called Canada a low payer or just about the lowest. How will you approach that at the upcoming NATO summit where defense spending increase is expected to be on the table?
Well, I would take note of the very strong endorsement by the Secretary General of NATO of our defense spending, of our defense investment plan, and being put in place. And I would humbly suggest that I think the Secretary General of NATO is probably more up to speed on the numbers than the President of the United States.
Next question.
Hello, Prime Minister. Paul Dutch, Global News. You spoke during the election about the need to build at speeds we've never seen before.
Yep.
Today, you met with the premiers. How soon should Canadians expect for you to name projects of national significance?
Well, it's that depends. It's it's the right question. You're absolutely right in the premise of the question. That's the need. But we're all responsible for that. When I say we're all responsible for that, obviously it's the federal government, the provinces, Indigenous rights holders, the proponents of these projects, labor, coming together, identifying where the criteria are met of this. And we will have, I can say this, reasonable degree of, a high degree of confidence. We have more potential nation-building projects than the country can build at any one time. And so the challenge is or the opportunity / challenge is coming together around, coalescing around certain ones so that they can move forward, and those will be jointly determined.
There's been first backlash from Indigenous communities, academics, even some of your own MPs about the bill's ability for Cabinet to override laws passed by Parliament. And you said earlier that we're in a crisis. So do you intend to use similar clauses for future legislation?
This is, no, short answer. I mean, this is unique balancing for what exactly the bill is seeking to achieve. And again, consistent with what we've been rightly stressing here is partnership with Indigenous peoples, but I will also stress consistency with our climate goals and environmental responsibilities.
Next question. Prochaine question.
Bonjour, Monsieur Carney.
Bonjour,
Valérie
Madame.
Gamache de Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada. Now, at the meeting in Saskatoon, you did talk about transmission lines and also pipelines in relation to Ms. Smith. Now, will the first projects be in the energy field? Will those projects be considered initially? Well, that's a very good question, but it depends. To be perfectly honest, that's the only answer, because there are projects when it comes to transmission lines, and there are a number of possible pipeline projects, gas pipelines or oil pipelines, but at the same time there are major projects that are very attractive. For example, a project in Quebec that's very attractive, or the potential energy corridor in the western part of the country at Gray's Point, in Inuvik, a project such as that. And there's also a potential project in Manitoba and Saskatchewan going as far as Churchill. And those are projects that could lead to the development of other projects involving critical minerals, for example. In the meantime, there are other projects, not necessarily in the list put forward by the provinces, that could come forward in terms of AI infrastructure. So it really depends. It depends on the process, and it absolutely depends on a partnership with the Indigenous peoples and the capacity of our workers and banks to bring it forward. So will it be more simpler for the first project that it be a project coming directly out of Cabinet as opposed to a province? No, there will be no projects that will come out of Cabinet. We are not the people in charge here. We play the role of facilitator at the federal role. We're not in charge, not at all. So basically the projects will be put forward by a province. The provinces, yes, or it could be put forward by a company. We want projects, and we want a number of projects, of course, that come from the private sector, perhaps with the assistance of the provinces and perhaps some federal aid as well, but with the capital and coming from the private sector. La Presse, I think the provinces are anxious to know what kind of projects you will be selecting. What's the timeline for that selection process? Well, first of all, they must be in the national interest, and therefore it has to be, there has to be some probability that they can actually move forward. We have to have the agreement of the Indigenous peoples. They also have to be consistent with our climate goals in Canada. So you've just pushed through a bill very, very quickly in the House of Commons to move forward with these projects. So what is the timeline to select those that will be accelerated? Well, we'll see. We'll see. We're just creating the possibility of doing that right now. But as I said, we are not in charge of this. This is the responsibility of people who will be sponsoring these projects. They will make proposals, including the provinces, of course. But at this point, and in Saskatoon, there was a long list of projects, 20 or more projects that were proposed. So there are examples, there are possibilities, and before Saskatoon, there was a list of some 80 projects. Or 90 rather. We started with 90, and in Saskatoon, there were 20. But at this point in time, starting from this point, people, promoters or provinces can see that it will be possible to move forward with this type of major project in Canada. There's a lot of enthusiasm out there as a result of this, and that will create good jobs here in Canada. That will also create great partnerships with the Indigenous peoples. It will create a good future for this country, a future that means we're independent, self-reliant, independent of the United States, and that's important.
Friday at 6, and we wouldn't be worth it without an exclamation point being put.
There does seem to be a little bit of a recalibration here in your language around Indigenous requests and demands, I would suggest, versus the first version of this. So I'm wondering what you heard from Indigenous groups, part of your Indigenous caucus, around how you needed to better reflect concerns of Indigenous communities in Canada.
Well, I'll answer this. You know what? I'll start, and I might ask the Minister to have the last word. I'll say the following. The spirit of what I'm saying, and much of this I had said before. I sometimes, it's other things are picked up in commentaries, press conferences, and debates, but not as clearly and as structured, if I look back, not as clearly and as structured, including in terms of process, to give life to what I'm saying. So the fact that we're, the first obvious thing, it always has been the obvious thing, but we haven't said that we would have this, these launch days so that we're working through with Indigenous right holders and others to help define where we're going from here around the project. That's one example. Secondly, we didn't, when we first released the legislation, I'll give you another example of some, if we'd had it all right at the start, we didn't specify that the money for capacity building, so that, it matters to have, this is actually, when you look at projects around the world, it's always an issue. How do people have money to do the work to decide whether a project is worthwhile? Because that's money down the drain if it's not worthwhile. And providing that money, in this case $40 million, which is considerable sum of money, that's an example as well. The Indigenous Advisory Council, which with feedback from ministers and others we put together, again, that's something that, to the spirit of your question, would have been better to be clearer about and direct about right at the start. So there's some learnings in all of that, but we were always coming from a place, if I may, always coming from a place where this is the enabling legislation that then begins the real work, which is this project selection and then the project specifications.
So these summits that you're going to have, these conversations you're going to have, those will shape the outcome, those will shape the approval process, those will shape the conditions on projects. What will they do?
Yeah, the shape, the expectations, or the joint expectations around all of those factors, but it's not, to be clear, it's not that we're going to have a summit in the middle of July and say, these are the 5 projects that we're going to do from that perspective. It's going to be, this is the type, if it is an energy project, how could it potentially move forward, what are the considerations, how the structures are, and those other aspects. So there's a better shared understanding on all sides of what's possible and where we can move forward. So with your permission, I'll give the Minister the last word.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I wouldn't say there's been a recalibration. These are the messages that I've heard in my one-on-one conversations with the Prime Minister. This is what I've heard in cabinet. This is what I've heard in caucus. I just don't think that it was public-facing. And I do think, there's a lot to learn in how messaging comes out. For me, I have taken and listened to all of the different voices and what their responses were in the past few weeks. So I'm very pleased that with the passing of this bill, now the real work begins. A prime ministerial-led engagement session launching dialogue, that's a serious signal that rights holders are at the table speaking for themselves, co-developing, co-defining what consultation means. How do you want to provide consent? What does economic reconciliation mean to you? And I'm doing this because it's so much more than just the economic component. You're also looking at environment. You're looking at culture. You're looking at the social aspect. And I think the Prime Minister has been really clear with his statements. There have been no projects selected. It is something that we will define together on a path forward, and that's the critical part, that Indigenous people are going to be sitting at the table, being a part of the development process, and making sure that Canada Strong is a strong future for everybody, including Indigenous people.
Thank you. This puts an end to the press conference.
Okay, that last word there was Mandy Gull-Masty, the Minister of Indigenous Services. Before that, an at-length press conference from Prime Minister Mark Carney really had a couple of components to it. A celebration of the significance of the passage of Bill C-5, his major projects legislation that was a centerpiece of his pitch to Canadians, at least in concept, but with a lot of reassurance to Indigenous peoples and groups who have been skeptical at the process, the way this has been pushed through in terms of very limited upfront consultation time with them, then rapid passage through the House of Commons and presumably the Senate, with significant reassurance from the Prime Minister and from his minister on the need for summits and listening, and that they will take into full consideration the concerns of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And also an admission there by Mark Carney that maybe they haven't been explicit enough at this up front, and that there were some learnings there that they needed to do a better job on this in terms of reminding people who have serious stakes in this that they will be listened to and that they have been heard. We're going to get quick thoughts from Greg, Fred, and Mel before we have to let them go. Greg, your thoughts on what we just heard there from Mark Carney?
Yeah, my beginning commentary to you today was concerning around that communication, and I think the minister said it, best. And the one kind of issue around this bill was just handled where you have very specific timing for when these meetings will happen.